Medieval music is songs and pieces from an era of Western music, including liturgical music and secular music. Medieval music includes solely vocal music, such as Gregorian chant and choral music, solely instrumental music, and music that uses both voices and instruments. This era begins with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century and ends sometime in the early 15th century, establishing the end of the medieval era and the beginning of the Renaissance music era is difficult, since the trends started in different regions. The usage in this article is the one usually adopted by musicologists. During the medieval period, the foundation was laid for the notational and theoretical practices that would shape Western music into the norms that developed during the Common Practice era. The most obvious of these is the development of a comprehensive music notational system which enabled composers to write out their songs and pieces on parchment paper. Prior to the development of musical notation, songs and pieces had to be learned by ear from one person who knew a song to another person. This greatly limited the geographic spread of songs or pieces. The development of music notation made it easier to disseminate songs and musical pieces to a larger geographic area. However, the theoretical advances, particularly in regard to rhythm, the timing of notes, and polyphony, using multiple, interweaving melodies at the same time, are equally important to the development of Western music. Overview. Instruments. Many instruments used to perform medieval music still exist in the 2010s, but in different and typically more technologically developed forms. The flute was once made of wood rather than silver or other metal, and could be made as a side-blown or end-blown instrument, while modern orchestral flutes are usually made of metal and have complex key mechanisms. Medieval flutes had holes that the performer had to cover with the fingers. The recorder was made of wood during the medieval era, and despite the fact that in the 2000s it may be made of synthetic materials, it has more or less retained its past form. The gem's horn is similar to the recorder as it has finger holes on its front, though it is actually a member of the ocarina family. One of the flute's predecessors, the pan flute, was popular in medieval times, and is possibly of Hellenic origin. This instrument's pipes were made of wood, and were graduated in length to produce different pitches. Medieval music used many pluck-string instruments like the lute, mandor, gitin and psaltery. The dulcimers, similar in structure to the psaltery and zither, were originally plucked, but musicians began to strike the dulcimer with hammers in the 14th century after the arrival of new metal technology that made metal strings possible. The bowed lyra of the Byzantine Empire was the first recorded European bowed string instrument. The Persian geographer Ibn Khaldun of the 9th century cited the Byzantine lyra in his lexicographical discussion of instruments as a bowed instrument equivalent to the Arab rabab, and typical instrument of the Byzantines along with the urn, shilyani and the salonge. The hurdy-gurdy was a mechanical violin using a rosined wooden wheel attached to a crank to its strings. Instruments without sound boxes like the jaw harp were also popular in the time. Early versions of the organ, fiddle, and a precursor to the modern trombone existed. Genres. Medieval music for both sacred and secular was composed. During the earlier medieval period, the liturgical genre, predominantly Gregorian chant, was monophonic. Polyphonic genres, in which multiple independent melodic lines are performed simultaneously, began to develop during the High Medieval era, becoming prevalent by the later 13th and early 14th century. The development of such forms is often associated with the Ars Nova style. The earliest innovations upon monophonic plain chant were heterophonic. Heterophony is the performance of the same melody by two different performers at the same time, in which each performer slightly alters the ornaments she is using. The organum, for example, expanded upon plain chant melody using an accompanying line, sung at a fixed interval, with a resulting alternation between a simple form of polyphony and monophony. The principles of the organum date back to an anonymous 9th century tract, the Musica Enchiriadis, which established the tradition of duplicating a pre-existing plain chant in parallel motion at the interval of an octave, a fifth or a fourth. Of greater sophistication was the motet, which developed from the clausula genre of medieval plain chant. The motet would become the most popular form of medieval polyphony. While early motets were liturgical or sacred, by the end of the 13th century the genre had expanded to include secular topics, such as courtly love. Courtly love was the respectful veneration of a lady from afar by an amorous suitor. During the Renaissance music era, the Italian secular genre of the madrigal also became popular. Similar to the polyphonic character of the motet, madrigals featured greater fluidity and motion in the leading line. The madrigal form also gave rise to polyphonic canons, especially in Italy, where they were composed under the title Caccia. These were three-part secular pieces, which featured the two higher voices in canon, with an underlying instrumental long note accompaniment. Finally, purely instrumental music also developed during this period, both in the context of a growing theatrical tradition and for court performances for the aristocracy. Dance music, often improvised around familiar tropes, was the largest purely instrumental genre. The secular ballata, which became very popular in Trecento, Italy, had its origins, for instance, in medieval instrumental dance music. Theory and notation. During the medieval period the foundation was laid for the notational and theoretical practices that would shape Western music into the norms that developed during the Common Practice era. The most obvious of these is the development of a comprehensive music notational system. However, the theoretical advances, particularly in regard to rhythm and polyphony, are equally important to the development of Western music. Notation. The earliest medieval music did not have any kind of notational system. The tunes were primarily monophonic and transmitted by oral tradition. As Rome tried to centralize the various liturgies and establish the Roman Rite as the primary church tradition, the need to transmit these chant melodies across vast distances effectively was equally glaring. So long as music could only be taught to people by ear, it limited the ability of the church to get different regions to sing the same melodies, since each new person would have to spend time with a person who already knew a song and learn it by ear. The first step to fix this problem came with the introduction of various signs written above the chant text to indicate direction of pitch movement, called neumes. The origin of neumes is unclear and subject to some debate. However, most scholars agree that they're closest ancestors of the classic Greek and Roman grammatical signs that indicated important points of declamation, by recording the rise and fall of the voice. The two basic signs of the classical grammarians were the acutis, indicating a raising of the voice, and the gravis, indicating a lowering of the voice. A singer reading a chant text with neume markings would be able to get a general sense of whether the melody line went up in pitch, stayed the same, or went down in pitch. For a singer who already knew a song, seeing the written neume markings above the text could help to jog his or her memory about how the melody went. However, a singer reading a chant text with neume markings would not be able to sight read a song which he or she had never heard sung before. These neumes eventually evolved into the basic symbols for pneumatic notation. The virga, which indicates a higher note and still looked like the acutis from which it came, and the punctum, which indicates a lower note and, as the name suggests, reduced the gravis symbol to a point. These, the acutis, glutis and the gravis could be combined to represent graphical vocal inflections on the syllable. This kind of notation seems to have developed no earlier than the 8th century, but by the 9th it was firmly established as the primary method of musical notation. The basic notation of the virga and the punctum remained the symbols for individual notes, but other neumes soon developed which showed several notes joined together. These new neumes, called ligatures, are essentially combinations of the two original signs. The first music notation was the use of dots over the lyrics to a chant, with some dots being higher or lower, giving the reader a general sense of the direction of the melody. However, this form of notation only served as a memory aid for a singer who already knew the melody. This basic pneumatic notation could only specify the number of notes and whether they moved up or down. There was no way to indicate exact pitch, any rhythm, or even the starting note. These limitations are further indication that the neumes were developed as tools to support the practice of oral tradition, rather than to supplant it. However, even though it started as a mere memory aid, the worth of having more specific notation soon became evident. The next development in musical notation was heighted neumes, in which neumes were carefully placed at different heights in relation to each other. This allowed the neumes to give a rough indication of the size of a given interval as well as the direction. This quickly led to one or two lines, each representing a particular note being placed on the music with all of the neumes relating back to them. At first, these lines had no particular meaning and instead had a letter placed at the beginning indicating which note was represented. However, the lines indicating middle C and the FA fifth below slowly became most common. Having been at first merely scratched on the parchment, the lines now were drawn in two different colored inks, usually red for F and yellow-green for C. This was the beginning of the musical staff as we know it today. The completion of the four-line staff is usually credited to Guido di Arezzo, one of the most important musical theorists of the Middle Ages, while older sources attribute the development of the staff to Guido. Some modern scholars suggest that he acted more as a codifier of a system that was already being developed. Either way, this new notation allowed a singer to learn pieces completely unknown to him in a much shorter amount of time. However, even though chant notation had progressed in many ways, one fundamental problem remained: rhythm. The pneumatic notational system, even in its fully developed state, did not clearly define any kind of rhythm for the singing of notes. Music theory. The music theory of the medieval period saw several advances over previous practice both in regard to tonal material, texture, and rhythm. Concerning rhythm, this period had several dramatic changes in both its conception and notation. During the early medieval period there was no method to notate rhythm, and thus the rhythmical practice of this early music is subject to heated debate among scholars. The first kind of written rhythmic system developed during the 13th century and was based on a series of modes. This rhythmic plan was codified by the music theorist Johannes de Garlandia, author of the De Mensurabilia Musica, the treatise which defined and most completely elucidated these rhythmic modes. In his treatise, Johannes de Garlandia describes 6 species of mode, or 6 different ways in which longs and breves can be arranged. Each mode establishes a rhythmic pattern in beats within a common unit of 3 tempora that is repeated again and again. Furthermore, notation without text is based on chains of ligatures. The rhythmic mode can generally be determined by the patterns of ligatures used. Once a rhythmic mode had been assigned to a melodic line, there was generally little deviation from that mode, although rhythmic adjustments could be indicated by changes in the expected pattern of ligatures, even to the extent of changing to another rhythmic mode. The next step forward concerning rhythm came from the German theorist Franco of Cologne. In his treatise Ars Cantus Mensurabilis, written around 1280, he describes a system of notation in which differently shaped notes have entirely different rhythmic values. This is a striking change from the earlier system of de Garlandia, whereas before the length of the individual note could only be gathered from the mode itself. This new inverted relationship made the mode dependent upon and determined by the individual notes a figure that have incontrovertible durational values, an innovation which had a massive impact on the subsequent history of European music. Most of the surviving notated music of the 13th century uses the rhythmic modes as defined by Garlandia. The step in the evolution of rhythm came after the turn of the 13th century with the development of the Ars Nova style. The theorist who is most well recognized in regard to this new style is Philippe de Vitry, famous for writing the Ars Nova treatise around 1320. This treatise on music gave its name to the style of this entire era. In some ways the modern system of rhythmic notation began with Vitry, who completely broke free from the older idea of the rhythmic modes. The notational predecessors of modern time meters also originate in the Ars Nova. This new style was clearly built upon the work of Franco of Cologne. In Franco's system, the relationship between a breve and a semibreves was equivalent to that between a breve and a long, and, since for him moda was always perfect, the tempus a beat was also inherently perfect and therefore contained 3 semibreves. Sometimes the context of the mode would require a group of only 2 semibreves. However, these 2 semibreves would always be one of normal length and one of double length, thereby taking the same space of time, and thus preserving the perfect subdivision of the tempus. This ternary division held for all note values. In contrast, the Ars Nova period introduced 2 important changes. The first was an even smaller subdivision of notes, and the second was the development of mensuration. Mensurations could be combined in various manners to produce metrical groupings. These groupings of mensurations are the precursors of simple and compound meter. By the time of Ars Nova, the perfect division of the tempus was not the only option, as double divisions became more accepted. For Vitry, the breve could be divided, for an entire composition or section of one, into groups of 2 or 3 smaller semibreves. This way, the tempus could be either perfect, with ternary subdivision, or imperfect, with binary subdivision. In a similar fashion, the semibreves division could be divided into 3 minima or 2 minima, and, at the higher level, the longs division could be 3 or 2 breves. Vitry took this a step further by indicating the proper division of a given piece at the beginning through the use of a mensuration sign, equivalent to our modern time signature. Tempus perfectus was indicated by a circle, while tempus imperfectus was denoted by a half circle. While many of these innovations are ascribed to Vitry, and somewhat present in the Ars Nova treatise, it was a contemporary and personal acquaintance of de Vitry, named Johannes de Muris, who offered the most comprehensive and systematic treatment of the new mensural innovations of the Ars Nova. Many scholars, citing a lack of positive attributory evidence, now consider Vitry's treatise to be anonymous, but this does not diminish its importance for the history of rhythmic notation. However, this makes the first definitely identifiable scholar to accept and explain the mensural system to be de Muris, who can be said to have done for it what Garlandia did for the rhythmic modes. For the duration of the medieval period, most music would be composed primarily in perfect tempus, with special effects created by sections of imperfect tempus. There is a great current controversy among musicologists as to whether such sections were performed with a breve of equal length or whether it changed, and if so, at what proportion. This Ars Nova style remained the primary rhythmical system until the highly syncopated works of the Ars Subtilia at the end of the 14th century, characterized by extremes of notational and rhythmic complexity. This subgenre pushed the rhythmic freedom provided by Ars Nova to its limits, with some compositions having different voices written in different tempus signatures simultaneously. The rhythmic complexity that was realized in this music is comparable to that in the 20th century. Polyphony of equal importance to the overall history of Western music theory were the textual changes that came with the advent of polyphony. This practice shaped Western music into the harmonically dominated music that we know today. The first accounts of this textual development were found in two anonymous yet widely circulated treatises on music, the Musica and the Scholica Enchiriades. These texts are dated to sometime within the last half of the 9th century. The treatises describe a technique that seemed already to be well established in practice. This early polyphony is based on 3 simple and 3 compound intervals. The first group comprises fourths, fifths, and octaves, while the second group has octave plus fourths, octave plus fifths, and double octaves. This new practice is given the name organum by the author of the treatises. Organum can further be classified depending on the time period in which it was written. The early organum, as described in the Enchiriades, can be termed strict organum. Strict organum can, in turn, be subdivided into 2 types, dipinta and diatessaron. However, both of these kinds of strict organum had problems with the musical rules of the time. If either of them paralleled an original chant for too long, a tritone would result. This problem was somewhat overcome with the use of a second type of organum. This second style of organum was called free organum. Its distinguishing factor is that the parts did not have to move only in parallel motion, but could also move in oblique or contrary motion. This made it much easier to avoid the dreaded tritone. The final style of organum that developed was known as melismatic organum, which was a rather dramatic departure from the rest of the polyphonic music up to this point. This new style was not note against note, but was rather one sustained line accompanied by a florid melismatic line. This final kind of organum was also incorporated by the most famous polyphonic composer of this time, Leonin. He united this style with measured discant passages, which used the rhythmic modes to create the pinnacle of organum composition. This final stage of organum is sometimes referred to as Notre Dame school of polyphony, since that was where Leonin were stationed. Furthermore, this kind of polyphony influenced all subsequent styles, with the later polyphonic genre of motets starting as a trope of existing Notre Dame organums. Another important element of medieval music theory was the unique tonal system by which pitches were arranged and understood. During the Middle Ages, this systematic arrangement of a series of whole steps and half steps, what we now call a scale, was known as a mode. The modal system worked like the scales of today, in so much that it provided the rules and material for melodic writing. The 8 church modes are Dorian, Hyperdorian, Phrygian, Hypophrygian, Lydian, Hyperlydian, Mixolydian, and Hypomixolydian. Much of the information concerning these modes, as well as the practical application of them, was codified in the 11th century by the theorist Johannes Aflymonsis. In his work he describes 3 defining elements to each mode: the finalis, the reciting tone, and the range. The finalis is the tone that serves as the focal point for the mode. It is also almost always used as the final tone. The reciting tone is the tone that serves as the primary focal point in the melody. It is generally also the tone most often repeated in the piece, and finally the range is the maximum prescribed tones for a given mode. The 8 modes can be further divided into 4 categories based on the final. Medieval theorists called these pairs manierii and labeled them according to the Greek ordinal numbers. Those modes that have D, E, F, and G as the final are put into the groups protis, deuteris, tritis, and tetradis respectively. These can then be divided further based on whether the mode is authentic or plagal. These distinctions deal with the range of the mode in relation to the final. The authentic modes have a range that is about an octave and start on the final, whereas the plagal modes, while still covering about an octave, start a perfect fourth below the authentic. Another interesting aspect of the modal system is the universal allowance for altering B to BB no matter what the mode. The inclusion of this tone has several uses, but one that seems particularly common is in order to avoid melodic difficulties caused once again by the tritone. These ecclesiastical modes, although they have Greek names, have little relationship to the modes as set out by Greek theorists. Rather, most of the terminology seems to be a misappropriation on the part of the medieval theorists, although the church modes have no relation to the ancient Greek modes. The overabundance of Greek terminology does point to an interesting possible origin in the liturgical melodies of the Byzantine tradition. This system is called octoechos and is also divided into 8 categories, called echoe. For specific medieval music theorists, see also Isidore of Seville, Aurelian of Arcuto me, Odo of Cluny, Guido of Arezzo, Hermanus Contractus, Johannes Coto, Johannes de Muris, Franco of Cologne, Johannes de Garlandia, Anonymous IV, Marchetto da Padova, Jacques of Liege, Johannes de Grocchio, Petrus de Cruz, and Philippe de Vitry.